Number 1. Armin Maiwes. He seemed like the kind of man who lived a quiet, almost invisible life until investigators uncovered a case so unusual that it stunned an entire country. It began not with anger or rivalry, but with an online exchange that would lead two strangers down a path no one could have imagined. Armin Maiwes grew up in the small German town of Rothenburg, known more for its calm countryside than for anything remotely sinister. Those who knew him described him as polite, soft-spoken, and almost gentle. He worked as a computer technician, kept mostly to himself, and rarely caused trouble. From the outside, he looked like a man living an ordinary life, isolated but harmless. Yet behind the privacy of his home and his computer screen, Maiwes carried a need he never shared with those around him, a desire for connection mixed with troubling fantasies he couldn't shake. For years, he drifted through life quietly, until one online encounter changed everything. In early 2001, Maiwes met Bernd Jürgen Brandes, a man from Berlin who had responded to his online posting. The two men exchanged countless messages, each one pushing the situation forward in a direction that no one would have believed if it hadn't been documented. Eventually, Brandes traveled to Maiwes' home on March 9, 2001. What happened inside that house was a deliberate act carried out with a calmness that investigators later struggled to understand. Maiwes carried out the killing, one he believed had been agreed upon by both parties, and afterward he continued as if life were almost normal. For months, nothing surfaced. No missing person alert, no dramatic search, no sudden panic in the community. It was as if the event had evaporated into silence. But silence doesn't last forever. Almost a year later, in December 2002, police received a tip from someone who had seen disturbing posts online linked to Maiwes. Officers arrived at his home, and what they found there, including detailed recordings and personal notes, left no doubt about what had taken place. Investigators realized they were dealing with a case unlike anything they had encountered before. Every new discovery raised more questions. What had motivated this? How long had he been planning it? And how had he managed to keep it hidden for so long? The deeper they searched, the more complex the story became. As the case reached the courtroom, the legal system faced a challenge. Maiwes admitted what he had done, but the debate centered on what the law should call it. The defense argued that the act was carried out with agreement, while the prosecution insisted that no consent could justify a killing. Trials in Germany rarely draw global attention, but this one did. Expert testimony, psychological evaluations, and digital evidence were all dissected in front of the court. In 2004, Maiwes was convicted of a lesser charge, but prosecutors pushed for a stronger verdict, arguing that the full intent behind his actions needed to be recognized under the law. A retrial followed, and in 2006, the court delivered its final decision. Maiwes was guilty of killing Brandes and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Today, Armin Maiwes remains in prison, where he is given occasional interviews, but otherwise lives a life far removed from the online world that once fueled his actions. He has expressed regret over the years, though many still question what truly drove him, and whether remorse came from understanding or simply consequence. When you step back from the details, this case raises a haunting question. How much of a person's darkness can stay hidden behind an ordinary face? And how easily can a life that seems quiet and stable spiral into something that defies comprehension? It is a reminder that some of the most unsettling stories begin not with chaos, but with calm, until one choice brings the truth into the light. Number 2. Robert Wilbert Tulloch and James Jennings Parker. It began like the kind of visit you might never question. Two young men knocking on a door in a quiet New Hampshire neighborhood. But behind their polite smiles was a plan that would shake a respected university community and leave investigators wondering how two teenagers could cause so much harm with so little warning. Robert Tulloch and James Parker were high school students from Vermont, well liked by some classmates and unnoticed by others. On the surface, there was nothing remarkable about them. They came from typical families, attended local schools, and blended into their small town routines. Yet beneath that normal image, Tulloch had grown obsessed with the idea of escaping his life, imagining a future that involved running away, living freely, and accumulating resources by any means necessary. Parker, younger and more impressionable, followed Tulloch's lead, drawn into plans he didn't fully understand. Together, they created a world of fantasies that slipped further and further from reality. On January 27, 2001, their plans took shape. Tulloch and Parker targeted Half and Suzanne Zantop, two well-respected Dartmouth College professors known for their kindness and hospitality. The teens arrived at the couple's Hanover home with the excuse of conducting an environmental survey for a school project, a simple story designed to lower suspicion. The Zantops welcomed them in, unaware of the danger standing in their doorway. What followed was a violent attack that left both professors fatally injured. Afterward, the teens fled the scene, trying to return to their everyday lives as if nothing had happened, but actions like these don't stay hidden for long. As the hours turned into days, the investigation gained momentum. Detectives found clues inside the Zantop home that pointed toward younger suspects: fingerprints, partial footprints, and items left behind. The randomness of the attack puzzled investigators at first, but the details slowly aligned. Tulloch and Parker's names surfaced, and within weeks the search for them stretched across state lines. The teens fled north, trying to reach Canada, but authorities caught up with them before they succeeded. Their arrest ended the chase, but only deepened at the mystery of why two students had carried out such a calculated act. When the case reached court, the legal process revealed two very different paths. Tulloch, viewed as the ringleader, faced the full weight of the prosecution. He was charged with first-degree murder for both killings, with evidence showing he had planned the attack long before that January afternoon. His defense attempted to argue about his age and mindset, but the severity of the crime left little room. Tulloch ultimately pleaded guilty, receiving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Parker's situation unfolded differently. Being younger and strongly influenced by Tulloch, he was offered a plea deal. His charge was reduced to second-degree murder, acknowledging both his involvement and his lesser role. In exchange, Parker accepted a significant prison sentence, though not a life term. The contrast between the two outcomes became one of the most discussed aspects of the case. One teenager condemned to spend his life behind bars, the other given a distant possibility of rebuilding a future. Today, Tulloch remains in prison serving life without parole, while Parker has served a considerable portion of his sentence and remains under the long-lasting consequences of his conviction. The two former friends, once inseparable, now follow separate paths, shaped entirely by choices made in their youth. Looking back, this case forces a troubling reflection. How can ordinary teenagers drift so far from the expectations of their age? And how does a single idea grow into a plan that destroys multiple lives? The Dartmouth murders serve as a stark reminder that danger doesn't always come from hardened criminals. Sometimes it begins with a quiet knock at the door, delivered by those no one ever thought capable of harm. Number 3. Michael Peterson. She was found at the bottom of a staircase, and from that moment on, nothing in the Peterson home would ever be viewed the same way again. What looked at first like a tragic domestic accident quickly grew into one of the most debated true crime cases of the early 2000s, raising questions that still linger more than 2 decades later. Michael Peterson was, by all outward appearances, a successful man living a comfortable life in Durham, North Carolina. He had served in the military, built a career as a novelist, and enjoyed a reputation as someone confident, charming, and articulate. He and his wife Kathleen seemed to live a life many admired: a spacious home, a blended family, and prominent positions in their community. Friends described them as close, social, and supportive of one another. Nothing about their lives suggested scandal or instability. But sometimes, though, most peaceful homes hold pressures no one sees. And on one December night, those pressures would become the center of a nationwide debate. On December 9th, 2001, Michael called emergency services to report that his wife Kathleen had been injured. Responders arrived at the house just before 3 a.m., finding her at the bottom of a staircase. Michael said she had been drinking, had gone outside to work, and must have slipped on her way back in. The explanation sounded simple, tragic, and plausible. But as investigators looked closer, the scene raised questions. There were patterns on the walls, details that didn't line up with a simple fall, and inconsistencies in Michael's timeline. What seemed like a heartbreaking accident slowly transformed into something far more complicated. Investigators examined the home, interviewed family members, and reconstructed the final hours before Kathleen's death. The event began to shift in their minds from an accident to a potential killing. The more they examined, the more they wondered, did a fall explain everything they saw? Or was something being hidden behind a calm voice and a practiced story? When the autopsy results came back, the uncertainty deepened. The medical examiner concluded that Kathleen's injuries didn't match a typical fall, and prosecutors pushed forward with charges. What began with a 911 call now became a full criminal investigation. Michael Peterson was arrested and charged with killing his wife. The trial that followed in 2003 was long, emotional, and filled with competing narratives. The prosecution portrayed Michael as a man hiding personal secrets and suggested that conflict erupted the night Kathleen died. They highlighted inconsistencies in the scene and brought in unexpected revelations, including a past death in Germany involving a friend found at the bottom of another staircase years earlier. While that case had never resulted in charges, its similarities became a major moment in the trial. The defense pushed back hard, arguing that the evidence did not prove intent and that the staircase scene was being misinterpreted. They insisted Kathleen's death was a tragic accident amplified by assumptions and speculation. In the end, the jury sided with the prosecution. In October 2003, Michael Peterson was convicted of killing Kathleen and sentenced to life in prison. The verdict shocked some and validated others, but it certainly didn't settle the debate. Almost immediately, supporters began raising concerns about errors, flawed testimony, and questions about expert credibility. Over the years, those concerns gained traction. One of the key witnesses was later found to have given misleading testimony in multiple cases, opening the door for Michael's conviction to be re-examined. In 2011, after years behind bars, Michael was granted a new trial. The legal tide had shifted. Instead of risking another lengthy courtroom battle with an unpredictable outcome, he chose a different path. In 2017, he entered an offered plea, a legal move where he maintained his innocence while acknowledging the prosecution had enough evidence to convict him. The charge was reduced to voluntary manslaughter, and because he had already spent so many years in prison, he was released with credit for time served. Today, Michael Peterson lives quietly, away from the spotlight that once followed him through every news headline and documentary. He has maintained his innocence, while Kathleen's family has remained firm in their belief in the original verdict. The case still divides people, and likely always will, because it sits in the uncomfortable space between evidence, interpretation, and the unknowable truth of what happened that night. And that's what makes the story linger. Two people alone in a house, one no longer able to speak for herself, and a series of clues that seem to shift every time you look at them. It leaves us wondering how well we can ever truly understand another person's final moments, and how one unanswered question can reshape an entire life. Number 4. Todd Kohlhepp. It started as a story of second chances, a young man finishing a long sentence and stepping into the world again, determined to rebuild his life. But behind Todd Kohlhepp's calm exterior was a history of control, anger, and manipulation that would eventually lead investigators to one of the most disturbing confessions of the 2000s. What looked like a new beginning in 2001 was actually the quiet start of something far darker. Todd Kohlhepp had already spent 14 years in prison before his release in August 2001. As a teenager, he had been convicted of a violent kidnapping, a crime that shaped how the world viewed him and how he viewed himself. After leaving prison, he tried to reinvent his life. He studied, got a real estate license, and built a successful business in South Carolina. Clients saw him as confident, smart, and unusually driven. Some admired his ambition. Others noticed he could be intense, short-tempered, and controlling. But few suspected anything beyond a complicated past. To most people around him, Kohlhepp was just a man trying to move forward. Yet beneath the professional image and polished smile, he carried impulses he had never truly left behind. On November 6, 2003, Kohlhepp committed the killing he later described as his first after prison. A man named Ben was found at a motorcycle shop near Spartanburg, South Carolina, along with 3 co-workers. At first, investigators struggled to understand what had happened. There were no leads strong enough to point to a suspect, no dramatic confrontation, no obvious motive. The case grew cold, and Kohlhepp continued on with his life as if nothing had changed. He expanded his business, bought land, and became known as a wealthy, self-made entrepreneur. Behind the scenes, however, he was beginning a pattern of targeting individuals in remote or vulnerable situations, keeping his actions separated from the life he showed to the world. For years, nothing connected Kohlhepp to any major crime. He blended in so effectively that even people who sensed something off about him could never explain it. That changed in August 2016 when 2 missing people, Kayla Brown and her boyfriend Charles Carver, disappeared without a trace. Their friends and families pushed for answers, and digital clues began to narrow down their last known movements. The turning point came when investigators traced Kayla's phone activity to property owned by Kohlhepp. On November 3, 2016, they searched the land, expecting to find evidence of the couple's fate. What they discovered instead was something no one anticipated. Kayla was alive, held inside a locked container on the property. Her rescue unraveled everything. Once investigators confronted Kohlhepp with the evidence, he began to talk. Over the following days, he confessed to multiple killings, including the unsolved 2003 motorcycle shop case and additional victims he had targeted on and around his property. His calmness during the interviews stunned investigators. He described events with a level of detail and detachment that left no doubt about the scope of his actions. Detectives now faced an entirely new reality. A successful businessman had been hiding a series of crimes for more than a decade, right in the open. The legal process moved quickly. Kohlhepp was charged with multiple counts, each one supported by evidence discovered on his land, statements from surviving victims, and his own admissions. The prosecution built a case showing a long pattern of calculated behavior. The defense had little room to work, given the overwhelming proof and Kohlhepp's willingness to explain parts of what he had done. On May 26, 2017, Kohlhepp pleaded guilty to 7 counts of killing, along with additional charges connected to kidnapping and other violent offenses. Instead of a lengthy trial, the plea ensured he would never leave prison. He was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, effectively ending his life outside the correctional system. Today, Todd Kohlhepp remains in a South Carolina prison, where he is expected to spend the rest of his days. Investigators still revisit his case periodically, questioning whether the full story has been uncovered. His confessions solved years of unanswered questions, but they also left behind unsettling gaps, moments that suggest he may have withheld details known only to him. When you look at the arc of Kohlhepp's life, one haunting idea stays with you. A person can build success, wealth, and influence, all while hiding something unthinkable behind a carefully maintained facade. It forces us to consider how well we truly know the people around us, and how easily a mask of normalcy can conceal a secret that changes everything once it finally comes into the light. Number 5. Ronald Dominique. He blended into the background so completely that almost no one noticed him. And that's exactly what made his story so unsettling. In the quiet towns of southern Louisiana, people thought they knew their neighbors. But for years, a man living among them was carrying out a pattern of killing that would only come to light long after the damage was done. His quiet demeanor became the disguise that allowed one of the most prolific offenders of the 2000s to move unnoticed. Ronald Dominique grew up in the bayous of Lafourche Parish, raised in a working-class environment where everyone seemed to know everybody else. He was described as soft-spoken, shy, and someone who rarely caused conflict. By his late 30s and early 40s, Dominique lived a life that seemed lonely but unremarkable. He moved between small towns, took on low-paying jobs, and often struggled with health issues. People who encountered him sometimes noticed a nervousness or awkwardness, but nothing that suggested danger. To most observers, he was just another local man trying to get by. But behind that reserve was a growing pattern of behavior that no one yet recognized. In the late 1990s, the first signs appeared. Men from the area began disappearing, later being found in remote locations across rural Louisiana. At first, investigators didn't connect the cases. Some victims were discovered weeks apart, others months. Their backgrounds were different, and the circumstances varied enough that authorities struggled to see a single thread tying them together. Meanwhile, Dominique continued moving between campsites, motels, and small rentals, staying largely under the radar. He learned how to avoid drawing attention, choosing locations and methods that made it difficult for detectives to identify patterns. Every time law enforcement began to make progress, the trail would suddenly shift again. By the early 2000s, the number of cases began to alarm investigators. More men were found under similar circumstances, and the frequency of discoveries increased. Detectives across multiple parishes started sharing information, comparing details, and finally recognizing a pattern in the locations where victims were last seen. Still, the case was challenging. Many tips led nowhere, witnesses offered little, and the person behind the crimes remained invisible. The public grew anxious, and officers knew that whoever was responsible had a clear understanding of how to avoid detection. Each new discovery raised the pressure, but also the fear that the perpetrator was watching their progress closely. The turning point came in late 2006, when a potential victim escaped an encounter and provided investigators with a critical description. For the first time, they had a name that matched someone already on their radar: Ronald Dominique. With surveillance, interviews, and forensic work, detectives slowly assembled enough evidence to confront him. When officers finally brought Dominique in for questioning, they expected resistance. Instead, they encountered something unexpected. He began talking. Calmly, quietly, he admitted to a pattern that stretched across the late 1990s and early 2000s. The scale of his confession stunned seasoned investigators. After years of searching through scattered clues, they suddenly had a complete picture from the man responsible. The legal process moved forward quickly. Dominique faced multiple charges connected to the killings he admitted to, and the evidence collected supported each one. Prosecutors prepared a case strong enough to seek the maximum penalty, while Dominique's defense team attempted to argue that he should avoid a possible death sentence by cooperating. Ultimately, he chose to plead guilty to 8 counts of killing. This decision spared him a full trial, but ensured that he would never walk free again. In 2008, he was sentenced to 8 life sentences without the possibility of parole, a punishment reflecting the scope of the harm he caused and the years he spent hidden in plain sight. Today, Ronald Dominique remains in the Louisiana State Penitentiary, serving his life terms. Investigators still believe he may have been responsible for additional cases, though only the ones he admitted to were officially tied to him in court. His story continues to haunt those who followed the investigation, because it reveals how easily someone can blend into a community while carrying out a pattern no one sees until it's too late. And in the end, the case leaves behind one lingering question. How many tragedies could have been prevented if just one detail, one clue, one chance encounter had surfaced sooner? It's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous individuals are the ones who seem forgettably ordinary, quietly moving through life until the truth finally catches up. Number 6. Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh. It began with a disappearance that sent shockwaves through international newsrooms. A journalist who set out for an interview and never returned. What initially looked like a risky assignment in a volatile region soon grew into one of the most widely followed investigations of the early 2000s, pulling a single name into global focus: Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh. Before his notoriety, Sheikh lived a life marked by dramatic contrasts. Born in London to a well-established family, he attended private schools and later enrolled at the London School of Economics. Those who knew him described him as intelligent, confident, and charismatic, traits that allowed him to navigate both academic and social circles with ease. Yet beneath that polished exterior, he developed strong ideological motivations that pushed him toward increasingly extreme actions. By the mid-1990s, he had left university behind and immersed himself in global conflicts, eventually becoming involved in high-risk activities that led to his arrest in India in 1994. After years in custody, he was released in a prisoner exchange in 1999, a moment that set the stage for the events that would follow. In January 2002, Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl traveled to Karachi, Pakistan, to investigate a story. Sheikh entered the picture through a series of deceptive messages and false identities that Pearl believed were leading him to an interview. For Pearl, this was routine. Journalists often relied on intermediaries to reach sources, but the arrangement was a trap. Pearl was taken, and the situation quickly escalated. When he failed to check in, colleagues and local officials sounded the alarm. The initial confusion soon sharpened into a clear crisis, and investigators realized they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a missed appointment. The search for Pearl moved rapidly. Pakistani investigators, aided by international agencies, traced digital communications, interviewed local contacts, and followed the winding path of messages that had lured him to the meeting. Every lead pointed toward Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh. Pressure mounted quickly as global attention intensified. News outlets around the world carried updates, and governments demanded answers. With each passing day, the stakes grew higher, and the urgency in the investigation reflected just how serious the case had become. On February 12, 2002, Sheikh surrendered to Pakistani authorities. His arrest marked a major breakthrough, but it also came with complications. He admitted involvement in the kidnapping, though the full details of who was responsible for which actions remained complex. Investigators pieced together a clearer picture using digital evidence, statements, and records collected throughout the search. The prosecution built its case around the planning, deception, and coordination that led to Pearl's disappearance, and the gravity of what followed. Sheikh's trial began in April 2002 and drew intense international attention. The prosecution argued that he was the orchestrator of the plot, while the defense raised questions about timelines, responsibility, and the reliability of certain evidence. Despite these arguments, the court found him guilty. In July 2002, he was convicted of the kidnapping and killing of Daniel Pearl and sentenced to death. It was one of the most high-profile verdicts Pakistan had issued in years, symbolizing the seriousness of the crime and the global pressure surrounding the case. But the legal story did not end there. Over the next 2 decades, the case moved through appeals, reviews, and legal challenges. Courts revisited evidence and procedural issues, leading to complex rulings that sparked strong reactions from both Pearl's family and the international community. Through all the legal shifts, Sheikh remained in custody, held in high-security confinement as various appeals played out. Today, Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh remains incarcerated in Pakistan as legal proceedings continue to be revisited and debated. The case stands as one of the most scrutinized of its time, not just because of the crime itself, but because of the geopolitical tension that surrounded every stage of it. And in the end, the story leaves a lasting question: how one individual, through calculated deception and far-reaching influence, could draw the world's attention to a single moment that forever changed the lives of many. It's a reminder of how quickly events can escalate when trust is exploited, and how a few messages sent at the right moment can set off consequences that reverberate across the globe. Number 7. Greg Malarick. It began with a marriage that, from the outside, looked steady. 2 people raising a family in a quiet Florida neighborhood, far from anything that resembled scandal. But on one September evening in 2001, everything changed. What first appeared to be a sudden tragedy slowly grew into a case that would follow Greg Malarick for nearly 2 decades, eventually becoming a story of suspicion, courtroom battles, and a verdict that surprised many who had followed the investigation. Before his name ever made a headline, Greg Malarick lived what seemed like a typical family life in the Gulf Breeze area. He worked steady jobs, raised children with his wife Sherry, and built a reputation as a man focused on home and responsibility. Their routines looked normal from the outside, the kind of everyday life people take for granted. Friends and neighbors knew them as a couple with the usual challenges of raising kids and managing work, but nothing that pointed to deeper conflict. That sense of normalcy made what happened next even harder for those around them to understand. On September 21, 2001, Sherry was found unresponsive in the couple's home. At first, investigators approached the scene as a sudden and tragic death, something that could have stemmed from natural causes or a medical emergency. But as the days passed, questions began to surface. Details didn't align neatly with the initial assumptions. Certain pieces of the scene raised doubts. And when investigators reviewed the timeline, they found inconsistencies they couldn't easily overlook. Slowly, the tone of the case shifted from tragedy to suspicion. What happened inside that home on that September night? And why were the explanations so difficult to pin down? As detectives continued to examine the circumstances, they began to focus more closely on Greg. They interviewed friends, co-workers, and family members, piecing together the final days leading up to Sherry's death. Forensic reviews added additional layers of uncertainty. While nothing was definitive, enough questions surfaced that investigators decided to move forward. The case grew cold for a time. resurfacing only when new experts revisited evidence years later. What had started as a mysterious death in 2001 was now becoming a potential homicide investigation, and the pressure on Greg intensified. More than 15 years after Sherry's death, a grand jury reviewed the case. In 2018, Greg Malarick was arrested and charged, accused of causing her death all those years earlier. It was a dramatic turn for a case that many believed had been long settled. Prosecutors presented a theory shaped by inconsistencies in the original investigation and new interpretations of expert findings. They argued that Greg's explanations didn't match the evidence and that the circumstances surrounding Sherry's final moments were not accidental. The defense, on the other hand, maintained that the state's case was built on speculation, not solid proof, and that the gaps in the evidence were too large to ignore. The first trial ended without a verdict, the jurors unable to reach a unanimous decision. The split reflected just how complex the evidence was, and how much hinged on interpretation rather than clear, indisputable facts. A second trial was scheduled, this time with even more scrutiny from the public and the media. The prosecution once again presented its theory, highlighting suspicious inconsistencies. The defense countered by pointing to uncertainty, forensic disagreements, and the long passage of time that had blurred details and weakened the reliability of certain evidence. After days of testimony and hours of deliberation, the jury returned its decision. Greg Malarick was found not guilty. Nearly 2 decades after the night that changed everything, he walked out of the courtroom acquitted of all charges. For some, the verdict brought closure. For others, it left behind a sense of unresolved mystery, because the core question of what happened to Sherry remains officially unanswered. Today, the case stands as one of those rare true crime stories where the courtroom outcome doesn't settle the lingering questions. Greg lives as a free man, legally cleared of the accusations. Investigators close the file. Yet the conflicting interpretations surrounding the case leave a cloud of uncertainty that may never fully vanish. The story endures not because of a dramatic confession or a definitive explanation, but because of the silence left behind, a silence that invites the mind to wonder what truly happened inside a family home on an ordinary night in 2001. And perhaps that's the most haunting part, a case where the evidence offered hints but never clarity, where the search for truth crossed decades, and where the final answer remains just out of reach, leaving a space only time can fill, or maybe never will. Number 8. Charles Erickson. He was a teenager who claimed to remember a murder in a dream, and his recollection sent 2 men to prison for a crime that, years later, a court would call into serious doubt. The case of Charles Erickson and the killing of Kent Heitholt is one of the most disturbing examples of how memory, confession, and coercion can fracture justice. Charles Erickson grew up in Missouri, a high school student whose life seemed rather unremarkable. Like many teens, he socialized, made friends, and dealt with pressures typical of adolescence. He wasn't a suspect anyone expected, but by the early 2000s, Erickson's life was colored by problems, substance abuse, risky behavior, and blackouts brought on by alcohol and drugs. After a 2001 Halloween night outing with friends, he claimed he had no clear memory of what happened, a detail that would become central to the events that followed. In the early hours of November 1, 2001, Kent Heitholt, a sports editor at the Columbia Daily Tribune, was found beaten and strangled to death in the parking lot of the newspaper's offices. There was no obvious suspect at first, no definitive physical evidence pointing to a perpetrator, and no witnesses who could give a clear, credible account. The case quickly grew cold. For years, the identity of Heitholt's killer remained a mystery. Then, in 2003, Erickson came forward with a story that shocked everyone. He said he had dream recalled the murder 2 years after the fact and implicated both himself and a high school friend, Ryan Ferguson. According to his confession, the two of them had robbed and killed Heitholt during a drunken night, apparently motivated by a desire for money after a night of partying. Investigators, eager for answers, accepted Erickson's testimony, and almost no physical evidence contradicted it. The legal machinery turned swiftly. In 2004, Erickson pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and robbery. In doing so, he essentially sealed the fate of both himself and Ferguson. Erickson was sentenced to 25 years, and his friend was convicted in 2005 for murder and robbery, receiving a 40-year sentence. Much of the case rested on Erickson's confession and the testimony of a single, now disputed, eyewitness. But years passed, and cracks began to appear in the story. Erickson recanted his confession. In 2012, under oath, he admitted that he had been heavy into drugs and alcohol at the time of the murder, that he had no memory of what actually took place, and that his dream memories might simply have been confabulations, false memories shaped by police suggestions, media coverage, and intense interrogation. The only other person who claimed to have seen Erickson and Ferguson in the parking lot, a janitor, also recanted. In 2013, the Western District Missouri Court of Appeals vacated Ferguson's conviction. The court found that prosecutors had violated legal standards by withholding evidence from the defense, including statements from a witness's spouse that could have impeached the credibility of the eyewitness who identified them. The court concluded that the original verdict was not worthy of confidence. As for Erickson, even though he recanted and the foundations of the case crumbled, his guilty plea remained intact for years. He continued serving time, while many legal observers and advocates pressed for re-examination of his conviction. Finally, in January 2023, nearly 18 years after his imprisonment began, Erickson was released from prison on parole. He had served roughly 18 of the 25 years originally ordered. Today, the murder of Kent Heitholt is officially unsolved. Investigators have reopened the case, occasionally responding to new leads, but no one else has ever been charged. The two men once convicted remain free, at least one, while others argue that justice was never truly served. What makes this case linger long after release day is how fragile memory and confession can be, especially when youth, substances, and pressure come together. Did Charles Erickson really commit the crime? Or was he, in his vulnerable state, manipulated into a story that suited a rush to closure? Either way, a life was lost, two young men spent years behind bars, and the real culprit, if there ever was one, may still be walking free. Number 9. Andrea Yates. She was seen as the quiet, devoted mother who always put her children first, until one June morning in 2001 revealed a reality no one around her could have imagined. Imagine a family that seemed peaceful from the outside, a home that looked ordinary, yet behind its walls a storm had been building for years. That is the world Andrea Yates lived in, and the world that would ultimately collapse under the weight of untreated mental illness, overwhelming pressure, and a sequence of tragic decisions that changed everything. Before anything went wrong, Andrea was known as responsible, intelligent, and soft-spoken. Born in 1964 in Houston, she excelled in school and later worked as a nurse. Friends described her as gentle, the kind of person who rarely raised her voice. When she met Russell "Rusty" Yates, the two quickly formed a bond built on faith, shared goals, and the dream of raising a large family. In the early years, she seemed to embrace motherhood with full dedication. They had 5 children between 1994 and 2000, and Andrea committed herself entirely to caring for them at home. But behind that serene surface, Andrea was struggling. After the birth of her fourth child, she experienced severe postpartum mental health issues that required hospital care. Doctors warned that future pregnancies could worsen her condition, but the couple continued growing their family. With each year, Andrea became more withdrawn, more overwhelmed, and more detached from the world around her. She tried to keep going, but the pressure only built higher. By 2001, neighbors noticed the spark in her eyes had faded. She seemed exhausted, fragile, and unable to keep up with daily life. Her condition was no secret, yet the seriousness of it was underestimated. Then came the morning of June 20th, 2001. Rusty left for work around 9 a.m., believing his mother would arrive shortly to help care for the children, but she didn't arrive in time. In those minutes alone with her 5 children, Andrea spiraled into a mental state investigators would later describe as completely detached from reality. One by one, she caused the deaths of her children in the family bathtub. She then called the police, followed by her husband, and calmly told them something terrible had happened. It was the kind of phone call that stops time, the kind no one could ever prepare for. When first responders arrived, they were stunned by the quietness of the scene. There was no chaotic aftermath, no frantic explanations, just a mother sitting in silence, waiting. The children were found in the home, and immediately the case became national news. People struggled to comprehend how someone with no history of violence could bring about such a tragedy. Investigators quickly learned that her mental health struggles had been severe in the months leading up to that day. She had been hospitalized repeatedly, placed on and taken off different medications, and evaluated by multiple doctors. Some believed she needed constant supervision. Others believed she was improving. The truth was somewhere in between, and dangerously unclear. The investigation focused not just on what Andrea did, but why. Detectives questioned doctors, family members, and friends, trying to piece together the timeline of her deterioration. Medical records showed that she had been diagnosed with severe postpartum mental illness and had previously expressed disturbing thoughts. Yet despite these warning signs, she had been left alone with the children that morning. Every detail, every medical note, every decision became part of the larger discussion about responsibility, treatment, and prevention. When the case went to trial in 2002, the courtroom became a national spotlight. The prosecution argued that Andrea knew her actions were wrong and should be held fully accountable. They emphasized the deliberate steps she took that morning. The defense countered with a sharply different picture: a woman suffering from severe mental illness so overwhelming that she had lost her grasp on reality. Doctors testified about her condition, explaining how her thoughts had become distorted, leaving her unable to make rational decisions. For weeks, the trial unfolded with emotional testimony from medical experts, family members, and investigators. The question was not simply what happened. Everyone knew that. The question was whether Andrea understood her actions in the moment they occurred. In 2002, she was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. But the story wasn't over. 4 years later, her conviction was overturned after the courts discovered that a key witness had provided false testimony. That error changed the legal landscape of the entire case. In 2006, Andrea faced a second trial. This time, the outcome shifted dramatically. The jury found her not guilty by reason of insanity, accepting the defense's argument that her mental illness had completely overtaken her ability to make rational choices. Instead of prison, she was sent to a secure state mental health facility in Texas, where she remains today. She has access to treatment, structure, and supervision, and according to reports, her condition improved significantly once she was placed in long-term care. Andrea Yates's case became one of the most widely discussed and debated cases in modern American history. It forced the public to confront uncomfortable questions about mental illness, the limits of personal responsibility, and the systems that failed long before tragedy struck. For many, the most haunting element is how preventable it all seemed in hindsight. A series of warnings missed, brushed aside, or misunderstood. Today, Andrea lives quietly under medical supervision. She does not seek early release and reportedly participates in therapy and structured programs within the facility. Rusty eventually rebuilt his life, remarried, and later divorced, carrying with him the memory of the family he once had. The tragedy changed many lives, not only those inside the Yates home, but also countless families and medical professionals who recognized the urgent need for better mental health support. Number 10. David Parker Ray. He was a man who appeared ordinary to neighbors and friends, a businessman, a handyman, someone who seemed to live a quiet, unremarkable life in Elephant Butte, New Mexico. But beneath the surface, David Parker Ray cultivated a world of control, fear, and horror that stretched over decades. His story would eventually come to define one of the most chilling cases of abduction and violence in the United States, a case that investigators would uncover piece by piece before fully grasping the scale of his actions. David Parker Ray was born in 1939 and grew up in a small town in New Mexico. By most accounts, he was intelligent, articulate, and capable of charming those around him. He held jobs that allowed him to interact with the community, and many who knew him described him as polite and helpful, the kind of man who could easily blend into everyday life. But those who looked closer often noticed small inconsistencies in his behavior. An unusual fascination with control, elaborate home renovations that seemed excessive, and a secretive side that few saw. Behind this facade lay the heart of what would later be uncovered as his dark obsession. By the 1970s, Ray had begun abducting women, holding them captive, and subjecting them to prolonged periods of restraint, manipulation, and threats. He meticulously designed a soundproof trailer, later called the toy box, equipped with devices intended to control and terrorize his victims. He kept detailed records of his activities, including plans, equipment, and instructions, reflecting a meticulous mind devoted entirely to domination and manipulation. Ray operated with calculated caution, ensuring that most of his victims were isolated and that their disappearances would not immediately draw attention. Despite the hidden nature of his crimes, the consequences were devastating. Women were terrified for their lives, often believing that no one could find them. The fear he inflicted extended far beyond the immediate victims, affecting anyone who lived nearby once the truth emerged. Ray's ability to live a seemingly normal life alongside these secret acts allowed him to continue for years without detection. Neighbors saw a man maintaining property, repairing cars, and running errands, unaware of the trauma that unfolded just behind closed doors. Ray's activities finally came to light in 1999 when one of his victims managed to escape and alert authorities. Investigators quickly realized they were dealing with a prolific offender. A search of Ray's property revealed the custom-built trailer, implements of restraint, and a trove of documents detailing the extent of his crimes. Over the following weeks, law enforcement pieced together accounts from multiple survivors and examined evidence that documented years of abduction and psychological manipulation. The full scope of his criminal activity shocked investigators. Ray had repeatedly kidnapped, tortured, and assaulted multiple women, all while maintaining the appearance of an ordinary life. The legal process was swift once the evidence was overwhelming. In September 2001, David Parker Ray pleaded guilty to charges relating to his abductions and assaults, part of a plea deal that ensured he would avoid a potential death sentence while facing multiple consecutive life sentences. He was sentenced to 224 years in prison, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Ray never fully revealed the total number of his victims, leaving unanswered questions about the full scope of his crimes. Ray died in 2002 while serving his sentence, ending a life marked by horrific acts but leaving behind a case that continues to be studied for its complexity and the unusual psychology of the perpetrator. Investigators, criminologists, and psychologists continue to examine the Toy Box case as an example of how methodical planning, careful concealment, and psychological control can allow a person to commit decades-long crimes while remaining largely undetected. What makes the story of David Parker Ray so chilling is the duality of his existence. A man capable of fitting seamlessly into a community, maintaining a professional facade, and simultaneously orchestrating terror for years. It leaves a lingering question about human behavior, the masks people wear, and how evil can operate quietly in plain sight, only to be revealed when circumstance finally brings it to light.